Thank you, Senator Mitchell, for speaking with us today. It's an honor, and I know that our colleagues at the National Academy of Arbitrators and College of Labor and Employment Lawyers will appreciate this interview. You have had a long career, especially as a mediator, but in so many other positions. You've been a federal judge, Senate Majority Leader during passage of major legislation, a fact finder during the era of steroid use. You were the chairman of the Disney Corporation, and you have been involved in many conflict areas around the world to try to settle them. And as negotiators, mediators, and labor arbitrators, we would like to hear about your experience and those skills that you honed over your lifetime to be able to be effective. As a federal judge, what new skills did you need to have to become an effective, neutral decision maker?
I had been in court many times before as a trial attorney. At the state level, I served for a period of time as an assistant county attorney, prosecuting small crimes. And then I served as the United States Attorney for the state of Maine, prosecuting federal crimes in the state. The biggest difficulty I had in making adjustment from being a trial lawyer to a trial judge was in the speed at which you have to make instantaneous decisions. And I had always tried to think through every issue and every argument on both sides. But I recall very clearly the first time I presided as a federal judge, and a lawyer asks a question, the other lawyer jumps up and says, "Objection." And instantly, I had to say, "Objection sustained," or "Objection overruled." I mean, literally in a matter of seconds. And I knew that was the case going in, but I still was, I felt uneasy about it, that I had to make such snap decisions. And so for the first few trials I had, particularly the first one, I had a hard time sleeping at night thinking, did I make a mistake on this objection? Did I say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing? Gradually, like anything else in life, you adapt to it. I became reconciled to the fact that as a human being, all of whom are fallible, that I was going to make a certain number of mistakes. It's impossible that I could be 100% correct every time I made a ruling, and I just had to live with that. And so you do the best you can to be fair and impartial, make the best judgments you can.
I think a lot of us understand your position when we're in the room as labor arbitrators having to make those snap decisions and just hoping that we made the right one, and we just have to keep moving on, right? Yeah. After you became a judge, you were appointed to the Senate by the Maine governor. A few years later, you were elevated to Senate Majority Leader. What were the most important mediation skills you needed to get the job done, to pass major legislation like the Clean Air Act and the ADA?
I think probably in a personal sense, the most important thing I had to do was to learn to control my temper. Like everybody else, I had a temper. I'd get angry and yell at someone when I was displeased. And even when justified, I learned that it was a mistake. A few times I had arguments with other senators in which I knew I was in the right and they were in the wrong, but I was a little too tough on them, and some of my language was not appropriate. In my time in the Senate, I cast votes 6,000 times. So if I'm asking a senator to vote for me this week and I give him a hard time, how's he gonna react next week when I ask him to vote the right way, what I thought is the right way, on another bill. And so one of the best lessons I learned as majority leader was to control my temper. And very, very rarely since then, in other activities that I engaged in after I left the Senate, did I lose my temper. I tried to remain calm, to keep whatever discussion it was on the merits, not to be argumentative, not to try to belittle or undermine or irritate someone on the other side, to treat them with the kind of respect that I myself wanted to receive. And that took a while, but I do think I was able to get over it. And as I said, very, very rarely. I spent 5 years in Northern Ireland after I left the Senate, presided over several very, very difficult and contentious negotiations. And this was real life. People were being killed every day, bombings, assassinations, death threats. And so it was very, very serious. And it was hard to keep under control, given the tremendous hostility, the intensity of the feelings, the constant threat and reality of violence that surrounded us. But my time in the Senate had helped me, and I was able to control myself and to stay calm and to deal with people on a respectful basis, listen to arguments, even though I didn't think they had much merit, but try to give them the best and most fair consideration I could.
Well, speaking of Northern Ireland, to get the parties to negotiate in good faith, what tools did you use to overcome stumbling blocks such as mistrust, cultural differences, religious differences, especially during the heat of that conflict?
Well, we brought the violence to an end by getting an agreement, but we did not bring to an end the differences in outlook and religion and housing. It's still a very segregated society, still a lot of hostility, still a lot of differences and disagreements. I think it'll take time, a long time, for those to heal. I told in Northern Ireland many times the following story, that before I went to Northern Ireland and while I was still in the Senate as majority leader, I got involved to some extent in the conflict in Yugoslavia. You'll recall the disintegration of Yugoslavia into separate countries, Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia, and the tremendous loss of life and violence that occurs there, and it's still continuing as a problem. On one occasion, I recall visiting a small town on the border between Serbia and Croatia. When the war began, the Serbs gained the advantage, and they took control of the town, and they burned down a lot of the buildings owned by Croats. A year and a half later, the tide of war changed, and the reverse occurred. And by the time I got there, just about every building in town had been damaged or destroyed. And the mayor of the town, a young man, very able and thoughtful young man, I asked him, how long before Serbs and Croats will again be able to live side by side in peace and cooperation? And he said, Senator, we will repair our bridges and our buildings long before we repair our souls. And of course, repairing souls is the most important part, the most difficult part, and the part that takes the longest. And so I think it will take time, but I think it will happen in Northern Ireland, just as the violence was brought to an end.
Mm-hmm. So in Northern Ireland, how did you create the atmosphere to allow the parties to believe they were negotiating, that each other was negotiating in good faith. Good faith is the underlying key to any mediation or negotiation. And it seems to me that you must have done something to allow the parties to learn to at least trust each other in that setting.
Yeah.
How did you do that?
Well, I don't think the parties ever really reached the stage where they had complete trust in one another. It was extremely difficult, but I spent 5 years there. I chaired 3 separate but related sets of discussions and negotiations. At first, they wouldn't sit down together. In the end, some of the parties walked out of the talks. We never had a time when they were all in the same room together. People were constantly being evicted for participation in violence, returned. People walked out when they got angry, came back. I learned the hard way that the dramatic walkout is a standard feature of Northern Ireland politics. You get up, you make a fiery speech, you condemn your opponent. They always had a briefcase or something full of papers that they'd slam down on the table, make a big loud noise, and then they'd walk out before the other guy could answer. So among the many mistakes I made when I was there was knowing that they had this history of not listening to each other. Like politicians everywhere, they like to talk, but they didn't like to listen. And so I said to them, foolishly, because at the time I thought this was only going to take a few months, how wrong I was. I said to them, look, I'm a product of the U.S. Senate, where the rule of unlimited debate exists. I said, I've listened to 16-hour speeches, 12-hour speeches, 8-hour speeches. I said, I know one of the problems here is that you feel, many of you, you're not being heard by the other side because they walk out and won't listen. I said, but I will always listen. I said, you will be heard because I, as the chairman, will sit here and listen to anybody who wants to speak. Then I thought it was going to be a few months. Well, of course, it ended up being years, and how I regretted that later when I sat there and listened to the same people saying the same thing over and over again. Not hours, not days, not weeks, not months, but years listening to the same thing. But I did listen. And over time, if you listen enough, you can discern where there may be areas of overlap, where there may be areas of cooperation, where there may be areas of overstatement on one side. And it's also a sign of respect. Because when you genuinely listen to someone, not have your mind thinking about what you're going to say, or just genuinely listening, hearing what they're saying, they understand that you respect them and their views, whether or not you agree with them. On the very first day of the main negotiation, which lasted about 2 years, I said to the delegates, all of whom had been elected. They had had an election to a larger body called a forum. So everybody there was an elected official. Many of them in their other duties were what we would think of as mayors, councilmen, members of parliament, county officials. So they all had political backgrounds. And I said to them, I don't come here with an American peace plan. I said, there is no Mitchell plan. I said, if you ever are able to get an agreement, it has to be yours, because you and your families are the ones who have to live here after any agreement. I'm going home, you're going to be here, so it's got to be your agreement. And 2 years later, after a long and painful process, when we finally drafted an agreement, on the final day, when it was presented to each party, there were then 8 parties There were originally 10 political parties. 2 had walked out, never to return. There were 8 parties and 2 governments. And I said to them, every word in this has been written or spoken by someone from Northern Ireland. I said, these are your words, this is your agreement, and it's on that basis that I urge you to vote to accept and approve the agreement. And the 8 parties eventually did, and they went forward. And I believe that was a critical aspect of getting an agreement. They still weren't friends. They didn't drop all of their prejudices. They didn't engage immediately in friendly relations, and there still are difficulties, hard feelings, segregation. They still have something called the peace wall, which Catholics live on one side and Protestants live on the other, largely. But the agreement itself, which was imperfect, it was a political compromise, the best could be achieved at the time, was successful in the following way. The agreement was reached in 1998. For the preceding approximately quarter century, there had been an intense conflict. They call it the Troubles. And during the Troubles, according to the Northern Ireland Police Service and the Northern Ireland Bureau of Statistics, about 3,500 people were killed in sectarian violence, and about 50,000 were injured, many of them seriously and permanently impaired. They had a terrible, terrible process that they called punishment beatings, in which people would be subjected to truly violent assaults, and many of them permanently impaired for life. That was the 25 years for the agreement. In the 25 years since the agreement, in Northern Ireland, there have been a total of about 165 deaths. And so, effectively, the violence has ended. And there's no appetite, despite this continuing huge differences, there's no appetite to return to violence. There are fringe people on both sides who want everything their own way, but the vast majority, while they still don't care for their opponents, don't want violence to be the means of a political process in Northern Ireland. And in that respect, the agreement was successful because it created an opportunity for democratic dialogue, peaceful democratic dialogue, which sounds so easy to say, but can be so very difficult to attain.
Let's talk baseball. It might be your favorite sport, from what I understand.
Yes.
And you were director of the Boston Red Sox. At one point, you were asked to be the fact finder during the era of steroid use among baseball players. You accepted the job. Was there a concern that you may be perceived as biased because of your position? And if so, how did you counter that?
Yes. I had always been a baseball fan and a Red Sox fan, being from Maine, which is, of course, part of Red Sox Nation. I was in Anaheim, California, for the annual meeting of the shareholders of the Walt Disney Company. And as the chairman of the board, I was going to preside in the meeting. When the phone rang, I kind of hesitated, should I wait till later or go? But I went back and answered the phone. It was the commissioner of baseball, Bud Selig, who said to me, we got a huge issue here, this issue of steroids in baseball. And he said, I need someone to conduct an inquiry and make a detailed report and recommendations on what to do about it, he said. And you had been well received on what they call the Blue Ribbon Commission report on the economics of baseball, the competitive nature of baseball. He said, and so I wonder if you might consider doing that. And I said, well, I'll think about it. So I called him back and said I'd do it, and so I became involved. Now, the first problem I encountered was that the players who are members of a players association, their union, had not been consulted on my appointment, so they were kind of upset. Not that they had anything against me, but they thought they should have been involved in the discussions, and they immediately took a defensive and negative attitude toward the investigation, and they made a decision that they would not cooperate in the investigation because they could not trust the outcome. And the heads of the Players Association contacted each of the 1,200 players who were members of the Players Association. Players, each team, there are 30 teams, each has a 40-man roster, and so there are 1,200 players who are actively major league players who are part of the association. I had no authority to contact any player directly. I had to go through the association. So I wrote to every single player. The same letter, I wrote a letter asking them to cooperate, pointing out to them that in my view, the largest number of victims of the use of illegal drugs by some players were the majority of players who did not use the drugs, because they were then forced to compete on an unfair basis with someone whose performance was enhanced. In fact, they began calling these drugs performance-enhancing drugs, PEDs. And so I said, it's your interest to cooperate with us because you're the one who are most harmed by this. Of the 1,200 players, only 2 called me to cooperate. One was an active player, and he came with his wife. He admitted that he had purchased drugs, but he said that he had not actually used them, that his wife had been strongly opposed to it, and she had persuaded him. And he had witnesses, he had evidence to corroborate his story, so we did not include him in the report. The other player, who was a former player, very prominent, publicly said that he was willing to talk to me. He was a man named Frank Thomas. He had been a great player, a Hall of Fame player, spent his career with the Chicago White Sox, and he said he wanted to talk. And so I went to Chicago and I met with him, and he spoke very openly and said the drugs are widely used. He would not name names. He wouldn't give me the name of another player, but he said he wanted me to know that there was, in fact, widespread use, and he resented that he had to compete with players who used performance-enhancing drugs, and he did not use them, and he felt that was unfair. We also found out that although almost all of the active player roster did not cooperate on a regular basis, people leave the rosters. They retire, they get out of baseball, they do other things. As soon as they're off the roster, they're no longer members of the association. And quite a number of them wanted to talk. They were angry. They felt they had lost their jobs because they were forced to compete with people who were using performance-enhancing substances. They thought that was really unfair. And interestingly enough, much later, after I completed and submitted our report, which we identified directly a large number of players, many of them prominent, on whom we had solid, incontrovertible evidence that they had used it. When the Players Association and Major League Baseball were considering it, players started speaking up. First 1, then 2, then 5. And they made essentially the same argument that I had made in my letter to all the players. We who don't cheat are the victims of this inappropriate use of these drugs by other players. And we want strong enforcement. And so the recommendations that we made were largely adopted by baseball with the strong support of the players. And they, to their enormous credit, have been among the strongest, insisting that baseball have in place what I think is still the strongest program against the illegal use of performance-enhancing drugs of any sport in the world. The players support that. They're strong for it, and the game is better for that. So there's always going to be people who cheat, especially given the very large sums of money that are at stake. But it is an effective program, and they've done it. As to my relationship with the Red Sox, I agreed to suspend my relationship during the time that I was in the position of conducting this inquiry. It lasted about a couple of years, and I adhered to that commitment. And while the report was criticized because of my relationship with the Red Sox, 2 or 3 people said, well, he didn't mention the Red Sox in the report. Well, it's obvious they hadn't read the report because I mentioned the Red Sox several times in the report, so there was no substance to that. But I did the best I could. I had a very good legal team assisting me at my law firm, DLA Piper. And early in the process, we sat down, a group of lawyers. I'd been a judge, and these were very skillful and able people. And we sought to establish a standard of fairness and reasonableness. All of them were trial lawyers. How much evidence would we need to include a player's name in the report? And if the allegations about a player didn't meet the threshold, we felt there had to be substantial corroborated evidence of participation, that we didn't include them. So there were quite a few people whose names were mentioned once, an allegation was made, but there was no corroborating evidence, and we did not include the names, including some players who later publicly admitted that they had used drugs very widely for a long period of time. But the report was well received because it was done thoroughly and fairly, and it was one of the most interesting, although difficult, public assignments that I've had. And I still am a baseball fan. The Red Sox aren't doing very well in the last couple of years, but as we always say, wait till next year.
Were you surprised when the baseball union agreed to have your recommendations included in their collective bargaining agreement?
No, I was not, because I felt all along that the players understood and recognized the need for action, but they didn't want to break ranks. And the officials at the Players Association, they are reasonable, intelligent people. And they're fair people. They felt that they should have had a role in organizing the investigation. You can agree or disagree. I mean, it's clear the commissioner had the authority to do it, and I commend him for acting aggressively and actively on it. I mean, he did what was necessary. But I don't fault the members association, the leaders of the association or the players. That was their decision. They felt that they were not going to be treated fairly, and we decided that we would go ahead and we would do our utmost to treat them fairly. And in fact, when we had received evidence of any player's participation, I wrote a letter to each player. Now, we had to go through the Players Association, asking them to come to a meeting, told them that I would present to them all of the evidence that we had about their participation, offer them, and if they wanted to bring a lawyer with them, they could bring a lawyer to review that evidence, to disagree with it if they did, to make their argument, and I wanted them to be able to have essentially an opportunity to be heard before we included them in the report. And every single one of them declined. They would not meet with me. They would not permit me to present them with the evidence. They had made a decision that this is not something they were going to cooperate with. And I think their hope was that because of their lack of cooperation, the report would lack credibility. Unfortunately, I think that was a miscalculation. As it turned out, the report had a great deal of credibility. And the true credibility is that it stood the test of time. It has been sustained. The players themselves, as I said earlier, adopted and strongly supported the recommendations that we'd made for improving the drug testing program, which is essentially the whole purpose of it. So that's really what mattered. It wasn't so much who did what in the past. Everybody knew that it was widespread. We didn't have to prove that. What we had to do was adopt a reasonable, rational, effective system for dealing with it in the future. And the players and the association understood that, and to their great credit, they participated in putting it into effect.
The agreement also included an labor arbitration clause. How did that come about?
Well, there is a separate process of arbitration in baseball of longstanding, which preceded and continues after our report, that deals with players' salaries and working conditions. We have nothing to do with that. We wanted to make certain that any player who was accused formally of illegal or inappropriate drug use had a fair and reasonable opportunity to be heard and to make certain that his rights were protected so that there were no arbitrary decisions made about a person who didn't have a chance to have to know what the charges were, to respond to them with whatever evidence, to cross-examine witnesses. And so that's a separate procedure designed to provide fairness to those accused with violating the drug use rules.
In your book, you talk about your parents and growing up in Waterville and came to understand the dignity of work. Can you explain a little bit more about how that concept, the dignity of work, has impacted your life?
My father was the orphan son of immigrants from Ireland. Just before 1900, his parents and their 4 elder children who had been born in Ireland emigrated to the United States out of desperation and poverty. They were homeless, had no income. It was a very difficult time, and there was then what turned out to be one of the greatest migrations in all of human history as millions of people left fleeing poverty, famine, and lack of opportunity for what they felt was a new life in the new world, America. My father's parents ended up in Boston, where he was born in 1900. Sadly, he never knew his parents. His mother died. The father couldn't care for the children. And so my father and his siblings all grew up in Catholic orphanages in Boston. Back in those days, the nuns running the orphanages would take the kids out on weekends, what they call the Saturday specials, to the rural areas of New England. And after Sunday morning mass, kids would be lined up in front of the altar rail, 6, 8, 10 kids at churches all over rural New England. And anybody who wanted to adopt a child could just take him or her by the hand and walk out the door. My father was lucky. In a town in Maine, sometime around 1904, 1905, he was adopted by an elderly, childless couple who themselves were immigrants from Lebanon. My father's parents ended up in Waterville, a place called the Head of Falls, right on the Kennebec River, directly adjacent to a large textile mill. It was a very poor area. My father left school at the age of 10 and spent his life as a laborer, ended up as a janitor at Colby College. My mother went immediately as a young girl into the textile mills. She became a skilled weaver, and she spent over 40 years working the night shift in textile mills. My parents were very poor, and while they were not learned in history and government and politics, they understood the meaning of America. To them, it was freedom for them, an opportunity for their children. And although neither of my parents was educated, their lives were devoted to seeing to it that their children received the education they never had. From the earliest moments of my memory, my father drilled into us, you're going to go to college. You're going to study. You're going to do well in school. That was their goal in life. And in a larger sense, I feel that my life and the life of my three brothers and my sister, all of whom graduated from college, all of whom lived lives that my parents couldn't even possibly imagine. In a certain sense, our lives are a vindication of our parents' lives. That while they both died penniless, nonetheless, they were successful in achieving what their goal was, what their dream was. And so they were, without any doubt, the most influential persons in my life. And I think my three brothers and sister would say exactly the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I have one other question. What advice would you give to us, the mediators, labor arbitrators, and negotiators, that would help us become more effective in our conflict resolution positions?
The first thing, and this is not just in arbitration and mediation, it's in every aspect of life, is you have to treat people with dignity and respect. Too much of our lives today, especially our politics, is shouting, demeaning, not trying to lift myself up, but to drag the other person down. And you know yourself, and every one of the members of your organization listening to this knows that when they begin an arbitration or a mediation, they have to be respectful of the interests, the views, the personalities of those with whom they deal. And one of the most simple and effective ways of conveying respect is to genuinely listen to other people's views. Give them the opportunity to express them fully. The second point I would make is I found in my own mediations, both in the political arena, in the Balkans, in Northern Ireland, in the Middle East, is it's very important for people to hear the other side, which they often do not do. Or when there are lawyers involved, and I'm a lawyer, everything they say and receive comes through the lawyer. So one of the things I insisted on in the mediations that I conducted, some of them involving very large sums of money, billions of dollars, was that I met with each side separately, and then on the very first day, I met with the two sides together, and I insisted that there not be just the lawyers, but the decision makers for whatever, usually companies involved, and that they be present to hear the other side's argument, not filtered through his lawyer to his lawyer back to that person or her, but unvarnished, hear what the other side has to say. And I'd say to them, each side, take an hour. You tell your story to me, and you listen to you on the other side, listen to this story. And then you'll have your chance to tell your story. The decision makers then get a better, truer sense of what the issues actually are and how strong or how weak is their position. It isn't filtered, and this is no criticism of lawyers. They're doing their best for their clients, but it's important that people hear clearly from the other side. But I made it clear I expected it to be respectful. I didn't want any name calling, no arguments. consider it not an argument, but a discussion. And just let us have your views, why you think you're right, why you think they're wrong, and then the same thing on the other side. And usually I found after the first day, both sides had become somewhat more realistic in their assessment of the situation, in their assessment of the opposing side. Takes a long time. Usually, as you know, mediation is a voluntary process. Anybody can enter if they wish. They can leave anytime they want. So there has to be some sense of a desire to settle. Arbitration is different. It's more like a conventional legal process where you have an adversarial proceeding and a presiding judge. But I think a skillful arbitrator also can effectively, while adhering to the whatever rules and regulations apply to that arbitration, can make it more human because it is smaller, it's generally not public, and you can make people feel at home. And the first and foremost, and I believe most important way, is to genuinely listen to their point of view, try to discard your preconceptions, hear what they have to say, why they believe as they do, their arguments are, and then take it from there. And almost every mediation that I became involved in, we eventually settled. And I took the position that I would not, on my own volition, suggest a compromise. Usually it's almost always in dollars. One of the great inventions of all time is money, because you're able to translate into a universal form interests that are not otherwise compatible. But eventually, in all the ones I've had, after enough discussion, the two sides came to me and said, well, we'd like you to make a suggestion, subject, of course, to their approval. And that's what I did, and in almost all of them, not quite all, but almost all, we were able to get a successful settlement of the case.
So listening is your number one rule, or your
Listening
number one advice to
Listening respectfully.
respectfully.
Yes. And not through gestures, facial, laughing or scowling or anything, conveying a sincere and genuine interest in hearing what someone has to say, not imposing unrealistic limitations on them, give them plenty of time to have their message, and genuinely listening. Many people have thanked me for my work in Northern Ireland, and I've gotten all kinds of awards and stuff like that. But to me, the most meaningful statement was made by a man who had been deeply involved in the fighting, in the violence, who then, like many, had a conversion and became a vigorous advocate for peace. And after it was over, he said of me, he listened us to an agreement. I'd never heard the word used in that form before, but I think it's one of the nicest things anybody's ever said about me.
Well, thank you very much for talking with us today. It was a pleasure.
Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure and an honor for me to participate.
Thank you very much.